In this lesson, we're going to talk about how to develop lesson plans, not down to the specifics of specific subjects, rather what philosophy or what approach should we take to developing lesson plans. As we begin, we want to talk about several issues. One is that we are talking about the importance of a daily lesson. What happens so many times, especially on the high school level, is that we tend to think of our classes as a series of lectures on topics, and those lectures, the content might cover several days or a week or 2 weeks. And so we tend to think about our lessons as being a week long or 2 weeks long, and it's just that we go as far as we can one day. When the bell rings, we stop, we pick up again the next day, and just continue on with the lecture. The problem is that this doesn't take into account the way that our students best learn, or the way that we best learn for that matter. We don't tend to think in terms of 2-week-long lessons. Rather, we think of a lesson each day. And it's much more effective learning if we can break things down and think, what am I going to do today? What do I want to accomplish today? And how can I best do that? So that's what we're going to be talking about. And it's based on the amount of content that we want to cover. You think about what you're going to handle, what you're going to cover, and what can you do, and how can you best teach that. Now, I realize that for all of us, we have a limited time available to us. There's only so much that we're able to do. We might have 3, 4, 5 different courses that we're preparing for each day. And to think about developing a complete and well-rounded lesson plan for each class each day is going to get overwhelming pretty quickly. So I realize we do what we can. It might be that we have lectures developed for 3 classes, and in 2 of the classes we just continue on just doing the regular lecture plan where we go to the end of the class and stop and pick up again the next day. But maybe for one class, or maybe for one unit of one class, we think more about developing a lesson each day that has a definite structure to it, and then next year we can add some more lessons so that over the course of time we're able to develop a more complete body of lesson plans. The first thing we need to do is to determine our lesson objectives. That is, what are we trying to accomplish? In a way, this is what's been called backward design. That is, you think about where you want to end up, what's the goal you want to achieve, and then you work backwards on how you can best achieve that goal. So first you want to think, what are the objectives for today? What do you want to cover? Several ways that you can think about this. One is, think about how the students would answer, what did you learn in class today? What do you want them to be able to say about this? We learned today how to find the hypotenuse of a right triangle. Okay, there's your lesson objective. Or it might be phrased more formally. The students will be able to explain how something. Whatever it is you think when they leave today, they should be able to explain how this works, or they should know this. Students shall know the definitions of something. Maybe your focus in your class is on definitions for the day. So you think, well, by the end of class, students will know the definitions of various polygons with various numbers of sides. So that's your lesson objective for the day. Or it might be, students shall be able to test the alkalinity of a solution. Or students shall be able to factor a polynomial. The idea is, what is the one or just a few things that you want to accomplish today? When the students leave class, what do you want them to leave with? Now, good objectives, you'll notice, state what the students will know or be able to do. They do not state what the teacher will do, and they don't state what activities the students will do. See, we're thinking about what learning outcomes are we looking for? What do we want the students to leave our class knowing? It's irrelevant what you're going to do, except insofar as it leads to what they're going to learn. We're not interested in saying, okay, the goal for today is that I'm going to present the 3 perspective on ethics. You don't need students to do that. You can stand up in front of an empty classroom and do that. That isn't teaching. So just stating what you're going to do is not a valid lesson objective. And stating what activities the students will do is not a valid objective either, because a lot of times those activities are just means to an end. So, for example, your goal for the day would not be that the students will color in the states in the United States on a map. Because when you think about it, what purpose is that? I mean, your students are not going to leave your class and probably ever again in their life have to color in the states in the United States on a map. Your goal is more like something like, I want the students to be able to identify the states of the United States. The coloring activity is a means to that end. It helps them to identify it. So the goal is that they would be able to identify the states in the United States. So that's how you focus your lesson objectives. What do you want the students to know or to be able to do when they leave your class? Now, you then have to determine the assessments. If you know where you're going, you know what the goals are, you think, how am I going to measure whether they've achieved those goals? You can say that you want the students to know the 3 perspectives on ethics, but how are you going to know whether they actually learned that or not? How are you going to know whether you've achieved your goal or not? You need to have some way of measuring that. So you think, how are the students going to show me that they've achieved their objectives? What are they going to do? Have the students learned what you want them to learn? It's important that you know this so that you can know whether you need to reteach, that you can know whether you need to move ahead. Whatever it is, you need to know whether the students are actually learning it. So you need to check this regularly and not just at the end of a chapter or the end of a unit. Typically, on a high school level, we think about assessments and equate that to tests. So you get to the end of the chapter in geometry on circles, and so then you have a test on circles before you move on to the next unit. The problem is that if the students haven't learned the material at that point, the end of the chapter is pretty much too late to do anything about it, because you don't have time in the class to go back and reteach the material. You've got to move ahead or you're not going to get through the content. So you need to be checking along the way regularly, not just when you get to the end of a chapter or unit. And also be sure that you're measuring what you're teaching, that you're tying these in to your goals. One example might be in the area of vocabulary. If your objective for them to learn vocabulary is that they can use a set of vocabulary words in their writing. Maybe that's your goal. You're a literature teacher, you're a composition teacher, and you have vocabulary words, and you want them to learn how to use these words in their own composition. Well, if that's your goal, your measurements should be tied to that. So if your assessments are only along the lines of, here's a vocabulary word, match it with the correct definition, you're not checking to see whether they can use those words in their compositions. So your assessments should be tied in with the goals so that maybe you give them an exercise or you give them a quiz or something where you say, here are 3 of our vocabulary words. I want you to use these 3 words in a paragraph. Or something else to show that they're able to use the vocabulary in a composition. That's your goal. So your assessments need to be tied with that. Also, you're going to have short-term and long-term assessments. You might have an assessment each day, just one question at the end of the class period to see if they learned the main objective or not. And then you might have longer-term assessments where it covers the course of a unit or a quarter or a semester. Things that you can tell, did they really grasp what we were talking about this quarter? So you're going to have both types of assessments, but you need to think about, again, if you're thinking about your goals, what do you want to accomplish? How are you going to measure those goals? How are you going to measure to see whether they've achieved those goals? The next thing you do is you decide the best way to teach that. So you're working backward from your goals, and you think about how you're going to assess them. So you choose the methods based on what you're trying to accomplish. At times, there have been people who have complained about teachers who teach to the test. Now, there's a sense in which that is wrong. If it's a matter of you saying, okay, I know that I'm going to ask on the test what 5 plus 4 is, so you just learn what 5 plus 4 is, and you'll do fine on the test. If that's the type of thing you're doing, that's not valid. That is an improper way of teaching to the test. But we can also look at teaching to the test in the sense of you know what the assessment is going to be, and so you teach the students so that they will be able to succeed on the assessment. Here's an example from an ethics class that I've taught in the past. I know that on the test, I'm going to give them a grid like this, where we talk about the normative, situational, and existential perspectives in ethics, and talk about how each of those is necessary and how each of them is sufficient for ethics. Not trying to explain all that here, but just that's the concept that I want to get across. Well, during class, I'm going to teach them how to fill in this grid. I'm going to go through how the normative perspective is necessary for ethics and how it's sufficient for ethics, and they can fill in the grid as we go along. Then when I give them the test, I can give them this empty grid and tell them to fill it in. I've taught them the way that I'm going to expect them to do the assessment. I've taught them to succeed in that. Okay, that's the type of thing that you want to do. You think about how you're going to assess them, how you're going to test them, what outcomes you're going to look for, and then your teaching is geared towards them being successful doing it. So then you need to plan how to make the use of class time most effectively, how to make use of that. Again, don't just go until the bell rings. Don't just think, okay, well, I'll just keep teaching and teaching and teaching, and then we'll quit when the bell rings. Instead, you want to think about the effective use of class time. Most of us are teaching in periods that are approximately 50 minutes long. So we'll assume that. We'll just assume that we have a 50-minute long class period. So here is a sample plan for a lesson in a 50-minute class period. You might begin first with some type of introduction. You will need to draw your students into the lesson. Realize that when the students walk into your classroom, they're not thinking initially about, oh boy, we get to learn the Pythagorean theorem today. Instead, they're thinking, my boyfriend just didn't talk to me and I'm upset. Or they're thinking, we have a big football game this Friday night. Or they're thinking about, I'm going to soccer practice this afternoon. Or there are a number of things that the students have on their minds when they walk into your classroom. And your class lesson is probably at the bottom of that list. So you need to find some way to get your material uppermost in their mind and get their minds thinking into your class period. So you think of some type of introduction. It might be something eye-catching. It could be something that is startling or amusing, or something that gets them thinking that way. It could be something as simple as what I've done in my math class, where I have what I call bell work each day. When the students come into class, there's a problem up on the board. It just takes a couple of minutes for them to answer it, but they work on that on their own paper, and it's a problem that's going to lead into the lesson that we're doing that day. If it's a matter of doing the Pythagorean theorem, we might have them solve a problem where they have to solve something, or 4 squared plus 5 squared equals x squared, and they need to solve for x, or something like that, so that they're thinking about the material in the lesson. But there's some way you want to draw them into the lesson. Just take a couple of minutes with this. Then you have your first main lesson time. This might be a lecture. It might be some other activity. It might be them reading in the book. But this is your main content time, the new material that you're going to deal with. And this might be 10 to 15 minutes. Research has shown that 10 to 15 minutes of taking in new material is about all the brain can handle at one time. You know this from your own background, that if a teacher is lecturing for more than about 15 minutes at a time without a stop, pretty soon you get to where you're starting to tune out. So you think, okay, let's take about 10 to 15 minutes, go over some new material. Then we'll have a mid-class, what I call downtime. Now, I don't mean downtime in the sense of the students just lay their heads on their desk and just kind of zone out. But it's a time when you're not presenting new material to them. It might be some type of review. It might be that you've been lecturing for 10 to 15 minutes, so at this point you might ask them an application question. Okay, how do you think this would apply if we've been talking about the fourth commandment on the Sabbath day? You might say, okay, how would this apply to somebody who owns a business, whether they should be open on Sunday or not? Okay, you're not talking about new material now, but you're reviewing, you're building on what you've already had. Based on brain research, this actually gives the students' minds time to process the material that they've been taking in. But whatever it is, there are things you can do, whether it's other things that we can talk about in future lessons, such as think, pair, share, or other activities that they can do that will help to review or consolidate what they've been working on. So maybe 5 or 10 minutes of that. Then you can have a second lesson time. You go back to your lecture for another 10 to 15 minutes, or have them reading or something else of new content. And then you draw the lesson to a conclusion. At the end of the class period, you think up and you say, okay, now what have we talked about today? Let's boil this down to 2 or 3 main points. What have we done? And so you draw it to a conclusion and help them to kind of wrap up everything that they've done. So this is a sample structure for a class period. Now, you need to plan your activities accordingly. I'm thinking here about the introduction or the mid-class downtime or the conclusion time, or other things that you do during the class period, but you need to plan them and think ahead. Don't just do things off the cuff. You can get into trouble sometimes with doing that. I have thought about times when in teaching math, when I might say, okay, let's think about if we're factoring a quadratic equation, and then I just make up numbers and I end up giving them an equation that cannot be solved, or that goes far beyond what we've just taught. And so you want to plan questions. You want to plan what you're going to do ahead of time to think, does this fit with what we've been teaching? So you plan your effective questions and illustrations. If you give examples, if you give analogies, think about those ahead of time so that you're not doing something that might be irrelevant or that might lead you off track. We'll be talking more in a future lesson about effective questions. This leads into then, you want to plan your activities so that all students are engaged and not just one or two. Let's talk about questioning, for example. If you're going to ask them some review questions, if you say, Mary, what is the Pythagorean theorem? When you call her name Mary, the rest of the class instantly tunes out because you're not talking to them, you're asking Mary a question, they don't need to listen. Granted, you're going to have some of the really bright students, some of the ones that are just, on top of everything, they might be engaged still, but for the most part, the students are going to tune you out at that point. If you ask the question this way, if you say, okay, what is the Pythagorean theorem? Wait a few seconds. Mary, what's happened is all the students have thought about that question for a few seconds anyway. And then when you call on Mary, at least the other students have already given it some thought. So this is just one hint, but you want to think about how you can plan your activities so that all the students are engaged. Another one is the whole concept of reading from the textbook. Maybe you're studying a chapter in history, and a traditional way of doing this is to go around the room and each student takes turns reading a paragraph from the textbook. This is very boring for the students. It doesn't engage the students at all because the only student who's thinking about what they're doing is the student who's actually reading at that time, and even that student might not be thinking about the content. They may be, if they struggle with reading, they're focused more on just pronouncing the words, or if they're a bright student, they can read practically without thinking. So they're just mouthing the words. this doesn't do anything, and the rest of the students are certainly not engaged. They can be looking at the book because maybe they think, well, he might call on me for the next paragraph, so I better be ready, but they're really not thinking about the content. Or if you do go right around the room, they've already figured out, okay, if Mary is on this paragraph, Johnny's going to be on that paragraph, so I'm going to be on the third paragraph, so they're already looking ahead to what they're going to read. So, again, this doesn't engage all of the students. You want to think of ways that they're all going to be thinking, and we'll be talking about this in future lessons. Your activities then need to reinforce your objectives. Don't give them some activity or some game or some question or some worksheet just to fill time. Think about, how is this going to achieve the objective that I want to achieve? So you'll have some active learning and some review and reinforcement. Your lesson will have both. Active learning, where the students are engaged, where they're involved, where they're dealing with new material, and then there's going to be some time when they're just reviewing what you've talked about. Then finally, as I said, you want to conclude the lesson, draw it to an end. Don't just let the bell end the lesson. And occasionally, you're going to run out of time. And you say, oh man, we've just got so much to do, and you weren't ready for the end of class. That's going to happen. But generally, don't just do that. Instead, plan for a conclusion. Have a way to review the key points of the lesson. Go back over them, and maybe even have an exit checkpoint. I've had times when I would give the students index cards and say, okay, I'll give them a problem at the end that is based on what we've just studied. And it's just a 2-minute question, and they give me the card as they leave the room, and then I can immediately check and see, did they get the material? Did they not get the material? What do I need to do? So just to summarize now, we're talking about backward design class. That is, you think first, what are the learning outcomes I want to achieve? How am I going to assess that? And so what instructional strategies do I use to achieve those goals? If you have any questions or comments about this lesson, feel free to contact me at this email address. I hope this has been helpful.